The when I think about defining responsible AI, it really is, and I used a little bit of this terminology earlier. It is thinking about how do we minimize risk and maximize the benefit, right? How do we limit the risks that are related to the use of this technology or the deployment of the technology? And there's a piece of this that I think is also important, and that's the potential for unintended impact.
Mm.
So that's essentially what it is. It's establishing the kind of practice and practice across your people, process, and your technology.
We are so excited to welcome Diya Wynn to the podcast today. So welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
And we were talking before we started recording. So Katie and I got the pleasure to sit through one of Dia's sessions at Gen W conference, which if you haven't been, it's an amazing conference. Katie introduced me to it. And we always love that when we, kind of meet or see somebody, we put them on our list. And now we finally get to have you on the podcast today. So we are so excited.
Yeah, and I'm glad that we have the connection from to Gen W because it's a pretty amazing experience that Donna Orinda, pulls together, and I continue to go every year. I'm looking forward to next year as well.
Yeah.
Yes. So we always start off with, can you just share a little bit for our listeners about yourself, both personally and professionally?
Sure. So let's see, where do I start? Well, so I am a girl from the South Bronx. I like to share that just because a little bit of my story when I talk about this in certain audiences is to actually share that I started in technology and made up my mind being this little girl in the South Bronx at the night in the third grade at 9 years old. And I got a computer for having high achievement scores and reading and math standardized tests at the time. And it was a very basic computer, probably nothing like most of us, maybe most of your listeners have heard, but a Commodore VIC-20, one of the earlier personal computers. And even with all that it was in its basic form, it was something that really ignited interest in me. And I said I wanted to be a computer engineer. So I've been in technology, frankly, ever since. I had my mindset, went to college at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, and studied
Right.
computer science, dual degree computer engineering. I left the engineering part because physics was way too much. But computer science and mathematics, and that's been my career. I've spent now 3 decades in emerging technologies, and I've moved through all of the waves of the latest technology that we've been experiencing around digital transformation since the start of the internet, helping organizations understand how they now start to capitalize and leverage this new piece of technology. And that's moved from the internet to e-commerce, social media, mobile devices, and mobile device security, ontologies for a little while, a little bit of that space, cloud, and now AI. So, and my work in AI it's been largely focused on the understanding the risk and implications of the technology and helping people to think through considerations that need to be made to minimize those risks and hopefully reduce the unintended impact so that we can leverage the technology for all the good and the promise that people like to share about it.
I love the story of 9-year-old Dia getting this computer and that like sparked this journey for
It
you.
really has. Yes.
You are very active now and really a thought leader in the AI space. How did you come into that? And how did you know like this is where I want to be and make an impact?
So I'll tell you, this is a very personal story as well. I'm a mother of two children, two boys, and this was probably I want to say 2018 timeframe. About 2018 and 2019. And I was really sort of going through trying to make sure that we're preparing for them for the future. You would probably say it was a bit early in terms of where they were in their ages, but my concern was is the school system preparing them for what they're going to live into? And as a technologist, I'm seeing things, but didn't necessarily believe that the schools were readying them in the fashion that they needed. And so I started to do more research. And there were three things that I was finding at the time that they said was shaping the workforce of the future. It was data driving everything. And that has had a demonstrable impact on the way that we look at our roles, the work, the decisions we make. The second was AI and robotics. And we'll, of course, talk more about that in this conversation. And the third was virtual reality. And people have been underplaying virtual reality. I don't know why I couldn't say that, but people have been underplaying the necessity or the strength of that platform and what it's doing. But there's a lot to be said there. And
Okay.
one of the key things with those three areas that I uncovered, one, of course, we were not quite getting there in terms of the school systems and what they were providing for my sons, but also the people that were making decisions about that technology didn't look like my sons or the community from which I come from and or identify. And we're finding that there was a great bit of disparate impact
Mm,
and sometimes harmful impacts as a result of
mm,
decisions that weren't inclusive of them. And so I had this opportunity at one of the largest technology companies to think about how could we be a part of shaping that direction? How could I create space for my sons and others that may not be considered in the technology decisions that were now shaping the workforce or shaping the future? And so I wrote a paper. I did a lot of research and study. Of course, my background is technology, so this would be another area of emerging technology. And of course, that made sense. But now it was how do we carve out a place that looks like what would have an impact on my ultimate goal? And perhaps I didn't think about how meaningful that was going to be future, but I knew it meant something for my sons. And I was sure that that meant that it was going to have a broader impact. And it certainly has. And so that was again early at the end of 2019, and I wrote a paper. We call that an Amazon a narrative,
Mm.
and pushed to have a team, a new practice focused on responsible AI. And that really was the start of this. It was the motivation of making sure my sons had a space that they would be able to hopefully walk into and leave my home. And that was a part of it too.
mm.
Would have a meaningful sort of future, right? And something that I felt like they were prepared for.
I love these stories, especially when it's like this personal connection and motivation. It does lead to, I just think, bigger things. Okay. So you're out and about, maybe you're at the next Gen W conference and you're meeting new people. How do you describe what you do today? What does that mean?
Yes. So I think the way, and my team we just had an offsite and they were doing this play on like Kill Bill for the team. So I sit in a public policy organization
Okay.
with a focus on responsible AI, but they were doing this play on Kill Bill to announce and give context for what the team was doing. And they called me the conscious. And so I think that that in some ways would help give an explanation of what I do. It is in some ways to drive conscience into the work that we're doing and the ways in which we're building technology and how that's going to have an impact in the future. So it is thinking about what implications might come. What are the concerns that we should have? What are the questions we should ask about how we're building and deploying this technology in ways that are going to matter for everyday people, including businesses and governments?
So I love that. And Dee, I want to go back to something that you said about, the schools and for your kids. Do you feel like that's gotten better? Like how have you seen that progress as you look at, where you live? Because I'll be honest, we talk about it a little bit, but it's something I think about too. So I was wondering, have you seen the progression since your initial kind of narrative and research to where you are today?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Now, I won't say that the schools are entirely there, but they are paying attention in a way that
Okay.
they weren't at the time. And that was ushered in by, that new technology, generative AI that came on the scene at the end of 2022. And that has helped to reshape or to help drive the conversation in ways that wasn't happening. It's opened everyone's eyes to the necessity to consider responsible AI, but also what does that mean for our students in terms of how we're educating them, and not just elementary school, higher ed, right? Training and certification. What do we think about in terms of the skills that are needed? Because how work is being done is now being transformed in ways, and we're trying to find our
Mhm.
place, as well as trying to introduce, means with which we equip people for what's to come.
Okay. Okay, so back to I want to talk a little bit about at AWS, you've championed a four-pronged strategy, and it's around mindful data, customer support, international standards, and academia. So could you walk us through what each of these mean? And for a supply chain professional looking at our own data, often very messy and siloed, if I'm honest. And so where is the most critical place to start to avoid embedding historical bias into the models, whether for forecasting or optimizing decision making? So I know there's a lot right there, but would love to hear your thoughts.
So let me tell you a little bit. The strategy is actually something that not just myself, but others were a part of, and certainly our leadership was helping to drive. But this was four elements that they found to be really important as we drive decisions about how we develop and deploy AI, both the services that were being used as well as those that we're building to deliver to others. And the elements are a little different. While data is important and holistic and robust and representative data is essential, we started out with people. And I think
Mm,
that's important because in the conversation, when we're seeing folks have concerns about the place where people have and shifting language and considerations around technology to people or people to technology, that the focus on people is important. And again, this is also connected to how do we equip people, diverse teams, investing in education in ways that they're prepared for the future, that they can help shape and inform the technology that's going forward. Then it was this holistic approach, making sure that we're not just thinking about the concerns about how we're developing AI at the end, but really bringing that throughout the entire life cycle. Oftentimes people will say and think that the decisions around what is safe or what's secure, et cetera, happens when the data scientist is doing their job. But those are considerations that need to be made throughout the entire life cycle. And then there was this idea that we're going to not just have principles defined. And when I was doing that research early in 2019, there were a lot of documents and references to people having defined and organizations having defined principles, these standards, right? And how do we take just these documents or these principles that are written and make those living, put those into practice with the kind of tools and guidance and resources to be able to enable that. And some people refer to that as like operationalizing it, right? Not just saying that that's what we do, but really seeing that integrated into the way in which we're working and building. And then the last was around advancing the science. So the kind of research that needs to be ongoing and the partnerships that were enabled to advance. Because at that time, when we were developing this strategy, and it's still true today, there are things that we don't know. The technology is advancing, and when we think about responsible implementation, we still have to be evolving and adapting our practice and our understanding along with how the technology is moving forward, and really making some substantial investments in what does standards look like, the kinds of research and new best practices or tools that needed to evolve in order to meet the moment as far as where technology was going. And so I think that that's the sort of foundational things. And when you think about, this shift, as you talked about with the supply chain, um, all of those things, right? Where do we invest? Are there unique things about supply chain that then requires us to do some additional research or have some additional understanding that then could be applied? Uh, uh, the principles, the practice, I think, is essentially the same, right? How do we
mm,
think about throughout the value chain where you need to make critical decisions or ask about exposing data, or having the right guardrails in place and ensuring that we're educating and equipping people along the way. So this really is about the bringing the thought process in, evaluating where there's risk, and then putting in measures to address those.
mhm.
throughout your entire like life cycle or value chain.
One
Yeah.
one quick follow-up. So you talked a lot about some of your research. I personally can get overwhelmed with where to get reliable information. Where do you start when you think about specifically in AI? There's so much and so many people out there. So how do you cipher through to know what's the right information, what's good information? Like, what are some places that you go to?
So that's a question I get asked often, actually, because there's so much now. And I think I was looking
Mm.
at a stat recently that said that 60, 70%, it might be even higher at this point, of the information that's in your feed is generated, right, by AI. If you're getting social media a lot, of course, we know that the results from our search engines are generated, and so how do you coalesce on what is real, what is misinformation, what's generated is a real challenge. So I have to be honest that I use, or be frank that I use AI in helping with some of that. And I also have a regular Google alert that will call through data that's provided on a daily basis in a couple of categories so that I can then look through those. And I will tell you that there's way too much that's happening on a daily basis that I'm able to fully absorb, but I try to go through and understand and distill like titles and then pick a few of them. On the work side of things, we also have an agent that helps to pull information from a number of sources. So, public policy articles. I look at Brookings a lot too, but that's looking at things from a policy angle as well as
Yeah.
stuff that's happening, sort of in the sort of global world and making connections to that. World Economic Forum is a source that I use. OECD, we have partnerships with those from a business perspective. Our sources, Stanford has their human-centered AI Institute. And like, so I pull from Harvard and MIT's paper, magazines or publications are ones that I subscribe to. All of those are helping, but I use these other sort of daily alerts as ways to so see what's surfacing as well to help. And typically, when you see connections across those, helps me to recognize where
Mm.
there is some validity. So we always tell people to check their sources, right? Like I actually look for multiple places, and even the things that seem real because it's structured like a news article or structured like a news brief doesn't mean it is. And then everybody will find credible sources they believe or they will want to follow, right? And some of those can be polarized in different directions, right? Advocacy, activism, right? Policy, they're all different ones. But finding those sources that and always checking back to it when you look
Super
at
helpful.
the things that are coming through.
I appreciate that too, because like you listed what I would consider really credible like institutions, right? And then looking for like the themes across. I also, one of the things that you said that really just stuck with me was like, even if you set up these standards and policies, they have to evolve because the technology is evolving. So it can't just be something like, oh, we set it, we're good. You have to constantly be evaluating and being, I think, open to evolving. So even if it was the most thoughtful process that you went through, over time that just might need to change because the technology changes. So I think that's something else I hadn't considered and appreciated that point of
Yeah,
view.
thinking so you talk about like this continuous cycle, right? Constant improvement, always looking for opportunities. And there's been questions about like how frequently that gets done.
Yeah.
Some people would look at their policies on an annual basis, right? And perhaps review those annually. There is probably necessity, depending on how dynamic your particular area of business is, to evaluate that much more quick, right? On a much
Yeah.
more regular basis, as new features are being employed or deployed. If you're using certain technology, well, then that may be an opportunity as well to trigger a consideration for whether or not we need to reevaluate or modify our overall policy because of new features that are
Yeah.
being considered.
What is one of the things, so when you think about responsible AI, we're in supply chain, as people are looking at this and trying to figure out, well, how do I even define this? What does that look like or mean for me? Like where can they start?
Yeah, I think the when I think about defining responsible AI, it really is, and I used a little bit of this terminology earlier. It is thinking about how do we minimize risk and maximize the benefit right? How do we limit the risks that are related to the use of this technology or the deployment of the technology? And there's a piece of this that I think is also important, and that's the potential for unintended impact. So that's essentially what it is. It's establishing the kind of practice across your people, process, and your technology. So we're talking about operating model, right? And the reason why I say that, again, it helps us move away from thinking that this is just a technical thing and that we're only looking at technical measures, right? The people element of it is, are we considering what this means for our employees or our customers? How does the behavior change? How do we have to equip them with the skills necessary to be able to operate in that environment, right? Are we bringing them and inviting them into the process? Because we know when we include and we invite people and we build with, people are much more likely to adopt
Yeah.
and adapt to that technology much more than pushing it at them. So that's the people element. Are we equipping our teams adequately? What happens when we may see a shift in roles or no longer a need in certain roles? Are we thinking about what that pathway is to transition into some other opportunity in the org? Right? That's people. And and this is often tied to change management, right? How do we address the people part? And that's usually the hardest part about the technology.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not the technology itself, it's the people element because they can resist if they're not bought in, right? And I think
Hmm.
we need to be mindful of that, even with this moment that we're in, what it seems like everyone can have, and I use air quotes everyone, because not everyone, even as simple as we believe we've made the technology, everyone doesn't have it. But how do we bring people along? And there is some reservation because of some of the implications, like the possibility that my role might change or the work that I do is different. And so the people element is important in that. The processes, how do we adjust the processes? And the better that we align, to existing process, the more adaptable this becomes. When we start to bolt on something new or introduce something additional, that creates some friction. That doesn't mean that it may not be necessary, but where possible in an organization, given its structure, integrating into an existing process. So for some people and some groups, they've looked at, you might have a team that is already looking at security assurance. How do we look at vulnerabilities in the process and we're looking at security specifically? Well, then this may be an opportunity to introduce some of the AI or responsible AI elements because we already have a team. They understand how to respond to these sorts of things, right? So that may be like a logical integration point. Do we have enterprise architecture teams? Well, maybe they could be a center of excellence that helps to drive standard practice throughout the organization, right? So the integrating of process and then the tools, the technology, what other things that we need to have in place so that we can constantly monitor the system, monitor the changes that are happening, evaluate the risks, understand where there might be bias and what we need to do with that. So those are the elements of that. And so that's how I would define it. Hopefully that helps to
I
create
think it's
and drive
so
change there.
helpful. Yeah, because I think, we hear this and we're like, responsible AI, that sounds so big. And how will we ever go after? But as you're talking about it, you're maybe speaking to some supply chain hearts here, where you're talking about like people, process, and technology. How do you identify the risks? How do you make a plan? How are you integrating across? Like these are things that we talk about in the sense of how are we operating and optimizing our supply chains. And so this is it's another element that we have to think about.
Okay, specifically for supply chain, we have certain systems and tools which are very black box, where they have the algorithm running in the box. People don't know what it does or they know kind of the output. So from your perspective, how do organizations balance that need for we want this high-speed automated decision making versus explainability, especially when things go wrong? And I know Katie and I've seen this when everything's good when it's running well, and then when something breaks and no one knows what to do or understands
It's the algorithm.
the algorithm or any of the software. And I'm a computer engineer too, so I get like when we get the programming, but if you go into somebody else's program, you're like, how do they do that? Why do they do that? And so how do you think about that? Because I know there is a space for that, but at some point you do need to understand as well.
Right. And I think those determinations generally need to be made as it relates to the level of risk that that system imposes and what the potential impact can be. Some of the legislation that people have been considering or governments have been considering is risk-based, right? If this has implications to someone's individual rights, well, perhaps it is more important then for us to understand how decisions are being made, what data it's considering, et cetera, because those stakes are much higher. And I think some people might assume that in supply chain, because we're talking about more internal systems, perhaps, and internal processes, well, maybe there aren't high risk sort of considerations here, and it may be more amenable to having this black box because people aren't necessarily the end result or
Mhm.
impact.
Mhm.
But I would venture to say that people are at the end result of most of our processes, even when we don't recognize it, right? So, if you're cutting a vendor and there's decisioning that's being made, as a result of how efficient they might be on their route or, other large workforce impacts that might be made as a result of some of the data that's surfaced or decisioning coming from a system, that to me is much higher risk, right? And would require
Yeah.
greater interrogation. Then so you would want to say that if we can't interrogate the system enough to understand, then those are potentially use cases where you don't use opaque systems, right? You can't use these black box algorithms in those particular contexts. And that's actually the way the legislation is starting to steer. So I think it's really about thinking through like and doing risk and impact assessment to understand where that falls, and then really making clear decisions about where we have lower risk and it's okay not to. So, and I use this example as very benign, but we're on video conferencing technology that mutes out sounds in certain places and it can clear up imaging and it does that on its own. And a lot of that is driven by AI detecting things and then making adjustments.
Mhm.
And these are low risk sort of use cases of AI. And it doesn't matter that we're involved or even us really understanding why it made the decision that it made. And if you use one of those that like mutes out the background, wonder why people's heads fade in and out, even though that's annoying, uh, it probably isn't as important to us, right? To really understand how it came up with that determining and why you end up floating because it can't recognize you or your parts of your body distinguished from your background. But that's different again when we might be potentially making a reroute, in the workflow, and that routing may actually have an implication to a community, right? Or
Mhm.
to a set of constituents that now may not get service or may be interrupted by, rerouting
Mhm.
traffic or et cetera.
Mhm.
So like those are different things that may require a better understanding and that have longer term
Mhm.
implications that we want to be able to think through. And having the right data to do that is important.
Taking away risk
Me
profile.
too.
That
Yes,
is
me
like my
too.
number one. Like I've written it down like 3 times. Like that is how you evaluate what the level is that you need. Yeah. Courtney, were you gonna ask something too?
No, me too. That was exactly. I was like, I
Risk.
think, because I think sometimes in engineering supply chain we can be very black and white, like yes or no, tell me what to do. And I do think we do have to think about the risk and implications, and that can help guide us as we think about, what tools we use and how we use them. So I think that was exactly my comment.
And this might even like kind of we might have already answered our next question here, but I'm gonna ask it anyways, just in case.
Okay.
You know, you work across so many groups. I mean, people in the boardroom, people in the technology space. We also work with groups of people from across. You might work in the warehouse, you might work in manufacturing. Sometimes it might be our executives. Where do you see like kind of the lost in translation when it comes to talking about AI strategy versus like how people actually end up having to use these tools, like this disconnect? Maybe you don't see it at all, but is there anything there that you're just like, hey, these are some watchouts I've seen before where we've maybe lost it when we were looking at it at this level versus people who are actually going to have to leverage and use these tools?
I think it can happen in certainly at probably every stage at different areas. So, maybe at the leadership level, they're thinking more about like the strategy, AI strategy as a deployment decision. And when we roll it out, it's done. And I guess like with your warehouse or procurement teams, they're dealing with like the daily edge cases, right? And
Yes.
much
Mhm.
more, in the flow of the things where the model perhaps didn't anticipate certain exceptions or the override that might be required because of like the existing, process. Now we need to do something manually, right? I think they live in the day to day operationally. And so they're going to see things much more differently than the our leadership would. Sometimes you have leaders that are really deeply ingrained, but I guess that sort of disconnect will come when we're, speaking different language ultimately, because they're seeing like the problem as they engage with the technology or engage in their normal process and where those sort of connection points come in. And I think the other part that's probably the most resonant or issue is like who actually absorbs the cost or even the pain when the model is wrong, right? Or when the
Mm.
application is wrong. And when I'm saying cost, I'm not talking about like the finances because the leadership will notice that, right? But the front line always is the one that's really experiencing and absorbing the impact of our poor technology decisions or some of the implications of those. Not always poor, but the implication of those, your front line is going to be met with that. And so I think that's some of the where that disconnect happens.
Appreciate that.
Okay, now we're gonna switch a little bit to talk about some of your work outside of your day job. So, as someone who actively mentors and sits on boards to advance STEM and equity, what is one practical action our listeners can take this week to ensure they are building a more inclusive talent pipeline within their own teams or organizations?
I think it's thinking about who's not in the room. I remember a conversation I had with someone who was building their team and they were believing that they were being intentionally diverse, right? Or trying to be intentional about bringing in diversity. And they shared with me this example of having two candidates. And they said that the two candidates were really well aligned in terms of what they believed they would bring to the table. This is their description of it. And so one person was um, a Hispanic and uh, did not necessarily go to an Ivy League school, but had a really rich background, but it wasn't the Fortune 500, like the major corporations. And actually, I said that wrong. They did go to like a Ivy League type sort of top school, and the other person was a woman. Happened to be a white woman, but had the sort of background in terms of the skills and experience, in terms of the experience, the companies that they were at, right? But they said that they both fared well, like equally in this interview. And so the individual asked me like, well, who would we have chosen or who should we have chosen? And the question I posed to them was whose voice was missing. In the case, the person that they actually hired, the white individual, and it was a woman, so that was a diversity sort of, right, like thinking inclusively. But I believe in the conversation where I challenged her was, did we miss an opportunity to bring in a voice and perspective that you didn't already have? And I think that's the focus, not necessarily on a specific ethnic group or
Mhm.
a
Mhm.
specific sort of age group or whatever, but is there a voice and perspective that is absent from your existing team that you actually could consider bringing in
Yeah.
that could add value to the way in which you're looking at the problems that you need to solve, the customers that you ultimately end up, uh, you know, responding to or meeting their needs for, because they vary. Right? And of course, we
Mhm.
can't have everyone across every dimension, but when you get greater diversity in, more than one or two individuals, there is something that happens in terms of the considerations that they'll give to the broader groups that typically are underserved.
I
Oh, go ahead,
I
Katie.
was gonna say, I love that advice because I think sometimes we go to hire and we look at the candidate and we get a slate of candidates and they might be wonderful. And so you're thinking through like how to be inclusive, but really taking a step back and also thinking about, well, what is my current team missing? So it's not just like, yes, you're trying to fill a role and you need somebody that can get those things done in that role, but you're also trying to build a really strong team. And I do think sometimes because it also means there could be times like if you have a really crazy experienced team, you could bring in somebody that maybe doesn't have that specific background because it's a fresh point of view.
Advice.
And there might be other times you're like, oh, I have a very junior team and I actually need to bring in somebody a little bit more seasoned and experienced. So there's an element there to keep in mind too. So it's not just like that role you're filling, but also that team you're building. I
Building.
love.
Absolutely. Yes.
And I would say Katie and I felt, I don't know, I feel this even in our She Supply Chains team, like with Elise and where she is in life and just her
We
knowledge
learned
of,
so much from her.
my gosh, social media, TikTok, all the things. Like, Katie and I are like, what? And I mean, it's just things that we don't even understand, think about,
And it
it's just not
helps,
in
right?
it.
Yeah.
It really does. And I do think about now we have all female team and I think we're amazing, but I do think like just in like age and experience and I
Hmm.
do think in corporate America we have a better chance to bring younger people into some of our strategy conversations
Hmm.
and make sure they have a seat at the table. I just don't think we do that well. Like that's my opinion.
So
And
it's really interesting that you say that. So on some of the larger teams that I've been a part of, when I say we, I've been in like employee resource groups and other sort of diversity initiatives where we were helping to drive very intentional conversations. And I probably shouldn't have used the word diversity and probably should have said inclusion initiatives, right? To bring in folks, and that was one of the things that we did, right? So we would bring, when we had opportunities to do like leadership meetings, you bring in a certain group at a certain level. And then you would find some rising stars. And you actually, and each manager would have an opportunity to bring in one person, for instance, or they would rotate when they brought them in. And so they got exposure at a level, right, that they hadn't previously. But as you said, there was also opportunity for them to be able to lend something or sometimes offer. Now, some may have been a little intimidated depending on what the environment was, but also the exposure makes a difference, right? Because you know that, right? Like they may not ever see that individual, but now because of that, that may create a pathway for some movement in the organization. And so there was a couple of intentions behind that. But I think you can do that too. Like I get invited to different conferences and stuff like that. And I will occasionally I get 2 tickets and I'll give one to one of my mentees, right? Because I'm like they get to be in a space that they may not normally have been able to, or invite them to the dinner that I get to go to that someone else does. But that's the way, as you said, to bring in their voice and to create exposure for them so that they can potentially
Mhm.
see something greater for themselves.
Yeah.
I love that. The
Yeah.
rising star. Gonna use that.
Mhm.
Okay. The time has like flown by, Dia, flown by. We wanted to wrap with a quick kind of mythbusters around AI. So some rapid fire here.
Okay.
We're going to start first with AI is inherently objective because it's just math.
Myth: AI is infused with the mind of its creator, just like any technology is. And so it carries the choices, the blind spots, the priorities of the people who built it and trained it.
All right. Okay. Responsible AI is a handbrake on innovation.
I would say that's a myth as well. I feel like responsible AI is an enabler for innovation, especially ones that we believe is really going to serve people better. It should be built responsibly. Myth. We're gonna keep our fingers crossed on this one, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, I'd
especially me
like
and
to say
Courtney.
that tasks automate or like AI can automate tasks. I think ultimately we should be making sure that we don't force it into automating judgment and accountability
Mm,
and rate relationship. And in my perspective, that's a design choice. It does not have to be.
super interesting. Okay. AI is only for tech giants with massive budgets.
Myth. Well, we were talking about the generative AI, coming on the scene, and the whole idea or premise, or one of the premises behind this, is that, you now have a technology in the hands of almost anyone, right? If you can speak language, if you can articulate, instruction, you should be able to use and leverage the technology. So, not the budget doesn't necessarily matter, just I guess, the willingness to leverage the technology and try.
All right. Well, that was fantastic, Dia. I have so many good notes, and I'm already thinking
Good.
about
I'm
some things
glad.
to get back to the office. So appreciate you spending this time with us and sharing more about responsible AI. I've had so many good learnings here today.
Me
I'm
too.
glad I had the opportunity to be here with you all. And thanks for inviting me. This was good.
Thank you.
Great.